You see why I fell in love with Rick Santorum? So Rick, what I want to do is, and I talked a little bit about this when I introduced you, is people know you from this kind of stuff, and they see you give inspiring speeches, and they've seen you on television, they watched you running for president all over the country. This morning, it was so interesting to me because I was sitting backstage going through run of show and getting ready, and Jackson, who heads our intern program, came back and he said, "Man, Rick Santorum's just out there walking around, hanging out with people." And I said, "Well, that's the real Rick. That's what he loves to do. He's just one of us." And I think that makes you unusual as a national political figure, right? Because you see all these national political figures and they get all the fame and they're surrounded by staff and they start to be separated from the people. So that never, for whatever reason, that never went to your head. So I want to dig in a little bit. Tell our folks a little bit about where you were raised and what your family was like, so they get a little bit of where you come from.
My father was an immigrant to this country. He was came over from Italy when he was a boy. My grandfather came from northern Italy. He was anti-fascist. Mussolini came into power, so he left, ended up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania as a coal miner. He mined coal for 50 years until he was almost 70 years of age. Grew up in a company town, so two-room house with a dirt floor. So that more than anybody else, my mom's family was an immigrant family too. They one generation away. My grandfather was the first born in this country, also from Italy, and so it was and my parents met after the war. My dad was in World War II, and they met after the war, both working for the Veterans Administration. So I actually spent the first 18 years of my life in public housing, if you will, but I lived on the grounds of a Veterans Administration. And it was I guess a unique upbringing, somewhat like an Army brat in some respects. We moved from VA to VA around. But I grew up with a deep, great reverence and respect for veterans, particularly because when I was in my formative years in the 70s, veterans were a dirty word. I remember, watching TV and seeing all these protests and how they were, being horrible to our men and women in uniform, and then opening up my front door and seeing these veterans who, sacrificed so much and are struggling so much with whether it was, physical ailments or mental health ailments. And people say, "How did you become a conservative?" I said, "I didn't become a conservative. I just knew I didn't want to be like these people on the left who didn't respect our veterans." And that sort of was formative for me, and to me that was a window into the left-right movement of this country. And so anyway, I also, obviously my parents worked for the government. I didn't see government as a bad thing. I saw them as trying to help people, and so I came at it a little different than most conservatives did, which is I saw government as something that could be a force for good. And that it wasn't, while I loved Ronald Reagan and supported him, I didn't necessarily see government as the problem. Now, having said that, once I got involved in politics, I started to change my opinion. and I saw government as more of a problem than a solution, because we went way beyond the bounds of anything that we considered to be constitutional government. But that's how I sort of got into it, and felt that I was being called into somehow serving the country.
Did you grow up in a big family?
I had a brother and a sister. My mom and dad, because of the war, got married later in life. They were in their 30s, which was old to get married back in the 1950s. My mother was darn near 40 years old when I was born, which was ancient back then. And so it was we were a small family. Like I said, we were not political. I don't think my father ever voted when I was a kid, and he felt it was, he didn't want to be involved in politics. And my mom, I think she voted, but I don't really know what party she was. So it was sort of a strange atmosphere, but it was one that allowed me to make some decisions, and I'm happy I made them.
So you have in a way, a famous public family. I mean, you've been a guy that stood for the family for so long, and so that's kind of brought a little bit your family into the public eye. Tell us a little bit about your family.
So Karen and I were married 2 weeks after the primary in 1990, when I was running for Congress for the first time, we got pregnant 3 months later. Got elected a month after that, and then started serving in Congress. So it was a big deal. My life has always been, and married life has always been in public life, and we tried to balance the public life and the family, and we did so primarily through just putting the family first and making sure that everything was as good as it possibly could be to weather the storms that were coming. And so we homeschooled our kids. We believed, this was back in the 90s when very, very few people homeschooled, and it was considered really weird. And it was an election issue. I mean, I was criticized for homeschooling my kids, but it's the greatest thing we ever did. Recommend it to everybody. I mean, everybody. That it's I have relationships with my kids because we were involved in forming them in their faith and in their morality and their ethics, and we cared about academics, but that was fourth or fifth in our line. Academics, you can pick those up along the way. You're not going to pick up the ethical and moral and values and spiritual values along the way in this country anymore. There's plenty of opportunities with our little computers and everything to gain knowledge and information, but to form children to be prepared for the hostile world that is America today and is Western civilization today needs a lot more effort on the part of moms and dads. And I think that's the thing. We're again, part of the greatest generation is, we didn't, the greatest generation thought that the culture would do for their children what it did for them, but it's not the same culture. And I think one of the reasons that the boomers and everybody sort of fell apart and America fell apart is because they trusted their children to the culture. That is suicidal or homicidal in the case of parents to do that to your children today. And so it's harder to be a parent today. It's a lot more work, but there's nothing, and you know this, but there's nothing, no more important thing you can do than protecting the souls of your children. I always tell people that we had 8 children, and I didn't get married till I was 32. We had our last child when I was 50, and my wife was 48. So go there, and so it was one of those things. We were just open. We believe that the greatest thing you can do in your life, the only thing you do in your life, it's true, the only thing you do in your life that lasts, the only thing you do that is eternal is working and cooperating with God to create an eternal soul. Everything else goes away. So you want to make a difference in the world, then leave the world with good souls that can make a better world. And so that's a lesson that we don't tell our children and we don't tell our grandchildren how important that the family is, but it is the most important. It's most important. That's why I wrote a book called It Takes a Family. Hillary Clinton wrote a book back in the late 90s called It Takes a Village, and so I wrote a response. And she was in the Senate at the time.
Only one of you was right, by the way.
Yeah, but I said, that conservatives have to focus on family policy. We have to focus on building stronger families. And I think we've seen the consequences of not doing that, and I think it's another important part of the conservative movement.
So you have 8 kids, and all miracles, because every kid is a miracle.
Yeah.
But you have one kid that is actually famous, and probably
we wrote a book about her.
Yeah, that you probably never expected to be the famous kid. Can you talk a little bit about Bella?
Yeah, when I was 50, we had a little girl named Isabella Maria, and she was born, we found out after she was born, with a condition called trisomy 18. You've probably heard of trisomy 21. That's called Down syndrome. And that's a child born with an extra 21st chromosome. And so having that extra chromosome disrupts the development in the womb and has certain characteristics that you are now familiar with. Everybody knows a Down syndrome kid. Although if you live in Iceland, They have eliminated Down syndrome. They're very proud of that, and which means they kill all the Down syndrome children in the womb, but they said they've ridded themselves of Down syndrome. If you've ever met a Down syndrome child, you probably know what they call in the Down syndrome world, they have an extra chromosome, and they call it the love chromosome because they're the sweetest, most wonderful children, but to a world that is utilitarian, they see Down syndrome as a burden. I see it as a gift from God. And our daughter has trisomy 18, which is a much, much more severe genetic defect. 90% of kids who have trisomy 18 die at or before birth. Of those that survive, 90% die within the first few months. And Bella beat all the odds. And I always say, we did a great job as parents, but Bella has been the greatest gift our family's had. Having a child with special needs in a family can tear a family apart. In fact, most families, it does tear them apart. We were very blessed that we accepted the burden. Life is about struggle. It's about burden. I don't know if you've read the Bible, but if you have, show me all the passages where God promised an easy life. None. He promised struggle. He didn't say, pick up your box of chocolates and follow me. He said, pick up your cross. It says before he was crucified, he said, pick up your cross and follow me. And so we were blessed because, we're strong believers. We were blessed in thinking that, every child's a blessing. So we accepted Bella. It was hard. I mean, she can't walk, she can't talk, she can't, she gets fed by a G-tube, doesn't do anything. She's a permanent 6-month-old. And so she needs complete, total care. And it's been the greatest blessing. We wrote a book called Bella's Gift. And we wrote 18 chapters. Karen and I decided we were going to write the book together. And then after an hour sitting there writing the book together, we decided that wasn't going to work.
Because you have a normal marriage.
Yes, we have a normal marriage. And so we decided 18 chapters that she would write half and I would write half. So we'd divide the chapters. So she wrote 11 chapters, I wrote 7. And
appropriately divided in a normal marriage.
Well, I mean, women have more to say than men, so it works out that way. And every chapter begins with love is. Because Bella, we always say Bella's our teacher. She teaches us what love is. And because you love by giving. That's how you love. And by the way, that's the key to happiness. That's what we found. And so we wrote this book, and I'll give you one example. I mean, so many profound things that happened with Bella, but one was standing over her bed and just seeing her and realizing that, she'd never be able to make me a coffee or be able to do anything for me. That she is totally dependent. She has nothing. She has no ability to do anything for me. Yet, when I looked at her, I knew, and she displays all the time how much she loves me. And I sat there and I thought, that's how the Lord looks at me. I can do nothing for him. I am completely disabled compared to him. And all he wants from me is to love him. And so Bella is... So Bella has been the great teacher. People have said that when I was in politics, Bella was born after I left the Senate, that I've mellowed since I was in politics, and that's true. Part of it is age, but I think a big part of it is my daughter, and I think it's been for the best.
So now you're at the point where you're having grandkids, and about a year ago, they're all miraculous, but a miraculous grandchild came into your life. Can you tell the story of Zelda?
Yeah, so one of the things I realized is that God, as I said before, if you're faithful, God will be faithful. And my daughter has been married 5 years, and last year, they've been trying to have a child, and they haven't been able to have a child. And so they went and we're Catholic, and so she prayed and prayed and prayed and went on a pilgrimage and to her favorite saint. Her saint is Saint Therese of Lisieux. And so she, again, prayed. She said, "Look, if you somehow give us a child, I'll name the child after your mom or your dad." And so that was sort of the framework. And so she gets a call on October 1st from a friend of hers who's at church in a mass. And the priest at the end of mass got up and said, "Hey, there's a woman in our community who's decided to give her child up for adoption. She's due in 2 weeks. And there's a chance that the child may have some genetic issues. There's nothing in the sonogram. Everything looks normal, but there's some potential genetic abnormalities." And so this woman, who happens to be a friend of my daughter's, calls her from the back of the church and says, "Hey, this is what's going on." And the priest was there, and she said, "You need to talk to my friend." So the priest gets on the phone with her, and long story short, within a couple days, she has a meeting with the mom, and in Maryland. And so she goes up and meets her, and then the mom sits across from her and says, "Well, tells her story. She's married. She has a 4-year-old, but not sure that she's capable of handling any child that has any special needs. They're not doing well financially, and they've got some issues in the home, and all this kind of stuff." And so Elizabeth says, "Okay, that's great." She said, "In fact, I actually contemplated having an abortion." And she pulls out her phone and hands her phone to Liz. It's like an iPhone 6. She says, "This phone does crazy things sometimes." And shortly after I'd found out that I was pregnant and we were going through this, I pulled out my phone, and the phone had called somebody. And by the time I realized that the phone had called somebody, the person had picked up the phone, and it was a priest. And I didn't even know I had the priest in the contact. I hadn't talked to the priest in 4 or 5 years, but it called this priest. And so I picked up the phone, and she said, "Father, my phone called you by mistake, but maybe I'm supposed to talk to you." And so she talked to the priest, and the priest connected her to a crisis pregnancy center. And the crisis pregnancy center works with a group of nuns in Washington, D.C. called the Sisters of Life. And so they connect to the Sisters of Life, and they start counseling her. And she said that, that the sister that she talked to wanted to send her a book. And so she sent her a book. And Liz said, "What's the book?" She said, "Bella's Gift." And Elizabeth's like, "Oh, okay." She said, "Did you read the book?" And she said, "Well, it was a really trying time for me, so I read the introduction. And I was just so moved. I decided at that point that I wasn't going to have an abortion." And Elizabeth said, "Well, you should know a couple things. First off, that book is about my sister. And that while my parents wrote the book, I wrote the introduction." And the mom said, and she said, "Well, you should know that I didn't read the whole book, as I told you, but I keep the book at my bedside. And it's still at my bedside. And every night before I go to bed, I look at that book, and I look at your mom and dad, and I say a prayer that whoever adopts my little girl will love her as much as they love Bella." And Elizabeth says, "Well, you should know one other thing. The sister that you talked to, could that have been Sister Mary Doolittle?" And the mom says, "Well, yes, it was." She said, "How would you know?" She said, "Well, 5 months ago, I was at a conference with Sister Mary Doolittle. And she's someone who I've gotten to know over the years, and she talked to me about a couple that she was counseling, a woman she was counseling who had a child that might have some issues, and that she told me that she sent her a book, the book Bella's Gift. And then she asked me to pray for that woman and the little girl. So I've been praying for you and your daughter for the last 5 months." And so she saw that as, and she does to this day, that this little girl was meant for our family. And interesting thing, I told you that she prayed to St. Therese of Lisieux. Well, the feast day of St. Therese of Lisieux in the Catholic calendar is October 1st, which is the day she got the call. And so we are very, very blessed. And I always tell this story that I told this story to a friend of mine, and his immediate response was, "I just bought a white pickup truck." And I said, "Okay." He said, "You know what I found out?" I said, "No, what did you find out?" He said, "Everywhere I go, I see white pickup trucks." Did you realize how many white pickup trucks there are out there in America? When you drive around, there are white pickup trucks everywhere. And I said, "Okay." He said, "It's like God. Until you experience God, you don't realize He's everywhere." And so, and this is what I keep coming back to. Zelly was a little girl like our Bella who had some disabilities. She was a little girl that was going to be aborted. I spent 30 years of my life working on the disabled and to save children from abortion. And God just said, "Thank you." God will be faithful. If there's any message I can leave to you as you take on what seems to be an impossible challenge to save the nation that He loved the most, if you are faithful, so will He be. God bless you.
Rick Santorum.